Hello, my name is Gertrude, and welcome to the Tech Girl podcast. In this episode, I have a conversation with Dr. Poornima Luthra. She's a keynote speaker, author, and DE&I expert. In a few minutes, I read her full bio, so you want to stick around for the full conversation. What stands out for me is our discussion around discomfort. We talked about the discomfort of confronting our own biases, the power of bias buddies. Do you know what that is? If you don't, stick around for the conversation because you will know. The role of neuroscience in helping teams move from fear to growth. Dr. Luthra also reminds us that allyship is not performative, it's practice. That change doesn't come from being right, but from being willing to pause, to listen, engage in real dialogue, and to unlearn. This is one of those conversations that lingers, one that challenges you to think inward before you can look outward. It's always easier to look outward and see what others are doing wrong and not look at yourself and dig deeper. If this resonates with you, then join me in the virtual conversation with Dr. Poornima. Hello and welcome to the Tech Girl podcast. This season, we are discussing the Diversity Dividend and I am your host, Gertrude. Today, I am so excited to have Dr. Poornima on the podcast, and I'll just take a brief moment to read her bio because it's amazing. So Dr. Poornima Luthra is a recognized author, keynote speaker, facilitator and trainer, consultant, leading practitioner in the academic field of talent management, diversity, equity, and inclusion. She is the author of Can I Say That? Leading Through Bias, The Art of Active Allyship, and Diversifying Diversity. She is also a contributor to the Harvard Business Review on topics related to DE&I. Dr. Poornima is a senior faculty principal lecturer of people, culture, and inclusion at Imperial Business School and external faculty at the Copenhagen Business School, where she works to effectively bring together academic rigor with practical application. She draws on over 18 years of research, teaching experience, and expertise in the field of talent management and DE&I in Asia and Europe. How does it make you feel when you hear that? And especially the younger version of you?
Such a great question. I don't think I've actually been asked that question before on a podcast. So if I were to look back and think about my younger self, I think my younger self would be quite surprised, pleasantly surprised, I would say, around the things that I have managed to work towards, achieve in terms of my goals. I think in some ways maybe my younger self would also not be surprised because I always had this desire to want to make an impact, to be an educator. So there's some parts of my career pathway that I think have always been, even as a child, that I always wanted to do. So I think a little bit of mix of both, but maybe the surprise comes from, I never thought I'd write 4 books in about 6 years. So, I think that's something that I think it would be, my younger self would be surprised with. Yeah.
Oh, that's amazing. It's good that you did follow on that as well. The younger self dream, and you're here and exceeded those expectations and empowering all of us.
Thank you.
Especially people of color, I would say, if I may.
Yeah.
Now, I'm hoping throughout this discussion, we will go through your 4 books and just your dedication to DE&I. But let's kick it off with, why have you dedicated a huge part of your work to DE&I?
I think I'm going to go back to kind of my childhood. And I think a lot of the seeds now in retrospect were planted then. If you ask my parents, I've always had quite a high awareness around social inequality that I saw around me with people's different experiences. And that really affected me as a child and teenager. So I think you could argue that some of the reasons why I got into this space was that, but also the fact that I always wanted to be an educator. believed very much in the power of education, the role that education really plays in shifting how we look at the world around us, to allowing space for multiple perspectives, also to ensure that what we are teaching is grounded in credible evidence and research. And that then led me on to doing my PhD. And during the PhD program, that's when I realized that there was a real disconnect between academia and research and practice. And it's not that the researchers, that we're not doing work that is relevant. We are very much doing work that is relevant, but we often write in language, or our articles are behind paywalls, or they're written with jargon that the practitioner just simply can't or doesn't have time, let's put it that way, to spend that time reading an academic journal article that is 25 to 40 pages long, and then has to go through all the methodology section and things like that, and really have to pick out the 5 things that they want to take away and try and implement. And so that became kind of my pathway to say that if we want to have impact in our organizations, then all this wonderful research needs to get out there to make the case for this. Because I think for me, a lot of it is that at least maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago, people were not convinced that there's anything that needs to be done, I suppose, in organizations, right? And since then, we've had multiple global events, regional events that have then shaped our understanding around this. So I think there's been multiple things. It starts in my childhood and then, of course, builds from there. Yeah.
Oh, that's amazing. About your childhood, if you allow me to ask,
of course,
where did you grow up?
So I was born in India, in Bangalore, and I left India when I was about 9 months, and moved to Manchester in the UK, where my dad was doing his PhD. And then we moved to Singapore when I was 4. So for most of my childhood, I've grown up in Singapore, and I moved to Denmark about 10 years ago and have recently moved to London. And I've spent some time living in Canada as well as in Denmark as well, prior to the last move. Yeah.
Wow. That's having a really global perspective on not just culture, but I would assume organizations as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Let's get into active allyship. What does it look like day to day for leaders, and how can organizations ensure that they are allies and that becomes more embedded and not performative?
Yeah. I think, the thing is, so when I started writing my books, I started with certain themes. And the first book, Diversifying Diversity, really looks at intersectionality and putting more on the table. So at the time I wrote it, organizations were very focused around gender, and perhaps, depending on where you are in the world, also topics around ethnicity, race, culture. And those were the 2 main areas, and others that, depending again on where you are in the world, perhaps LGBTQ plus rights was on the table. Now, the reality is these are extremely important, and at the same time, there are so many other facets to diversity where people experience discrimination. And so Diversifying Diversity was really that journey to expanding how we look at diversity, all the intersectional aspects of it, and to try to get closer to understanding the uniqueness and difference that human beings bring into the organizational context, and the value really that adds. Now, as I was writing that book, one thing became very clear is the question of what can I do to address this discrimination that exists out there in these various different aspects became the question to answer. And I saw that allyship, and particularly active allyship, was really the means through which we could answer that question. So allyship is a lifelong process of building and nurturing, supporting relationships with people from marginalized, discriminated, underrepresented, underestimated groups. And the purpose of allyship and active allyship, and I'll differentiate in a moment why I refer to it as active allyship, is to really advance inclusion. And inclusion is that feeling that we have that we are valued for our uniqueness, and we feel that deep sense of belonging, both of those things existing at the same time. Now, the reason I talk about active allyship is because there's also many of us who are passive allies. We might believe in the ethos of, or the basic core of what diversity, equity, and inclusion stands for, but we may not necessarily know what to say or do. And so we have to move
Exactly.
ourselves from being passive to actually being active. So it comes from the body of research around the bystander effect and not being the bystander and really stepping up to doing something about it. But also as I got into this space and started exploring it, it became also abundantly clear that people hesitate to engage with this. It's not easy. It's not a muscle that we know how to exercise or to use. Many of us haven't been trained in this area. So the idea of the book, The Art of Active Allyship, was really to bring out a set of really, really practical tips, behaviors that we can engage in order to be that active ally. So to move the vast majority of us who are passive to actually being active.
Oh, that's really great. Speaking of diversifying diversity, before I go back with a follow-up, one thing that stood out is when you talked about looking at the different categories of diversity, you mentioned family status, and I was very surprised. How does that play or come into the work situation?
So it's related to the category that I called socioeconomic background,
Yeah.
and that then affects where you the opportunities, let's say, you have in society and in life. And there's interesting studies that show that depending on the socioeconomic status of parents, and the higher the socioeconomic status of parents, their children have a higher starting salary.
Is it?
Yeah. And so that's interesting, right? We want to understand why. And when we
Yeah.
get into it, well, it's because when families have a higher socioeconomic status, they then have access to better educational opportunities, maybe educational support, maybe even sending their children or getting a house in an area where there's better education and better schools, sending their children to extracurricular classes that boost their various skills, not just academic, but also other life skills, but also access to healthcare and support for learning needs, for example. So all of these things put together, along with networks, because the higher up parents are in the socioeconomic ladder, if you'd like, then the access to different networks because of their own career, job opportunities that they have, means that their children then have the opportunity to be around these communities. They get influenced by these communities. So those networks also then be the way in which children might have an informal internship or a conversation with someone that inspires them. And we cannot underestimate the influence that these networks and educational opportunities, access to healthcare, actually has an influence and an impact on what those opportunities are. It is incredible when you start looking at the role that socioeconomic status actually plays. And that intersects, so it's an intersectional piece that intersects with, for example, ethnicity and culture. And so understanding those nuances, it might intersect with religion, it might intersect with geography and where we live. And so it is educational opportunity. So there's a lot of links with many other dimensions of diversity that I look at in the book.
Yeah, that's very true. I can sort of recognize how those informal setups can really accelerate opportunities for many people. But I also like this idea of the intersection, because many other times that people will just take one category and leave out the other categories that make one diverse, like people will maybe go with gender or race and forgetting all these other things. That's why I like that you brought up the intersection.
Exactly.
Now, when it comes to allies, have there been moments where well-meaning, intentioned allies have made mistakes, and where does that show up? or the
So
common mistake that they make?
I think there are a few here. I think one thing before I start talking about some of those examples, I think one of the things we need to keep in mind is intention versus impact. And that's a really important distinction. So well-meaning allies might intend not to cause harm, but it might be that through their actions, they do end up causing harm. And regardless of the intention, as long as harm is caused, then of course there's something that we do need to address here. So I think that even those of us, and I include myself in it, that there are times we do make mistakes, right? We might not have seen something. We may not recognize a bias or a prejudice that we hold. And it comes out through the language that we use and the narratives that we use or ask of others. And there are many examples, of course, but I often like to use myself and my own embarrassment because I also then think it creates space for others to have these conversations. Even someone who is working in this space, of course, we do make mistakes. We do hold biases. And everyone, if you have a brain, you are biased. Everyone has biases. So this was a number of years ago, and I write this, of course, in my books as well, that I was sitting at dinner with my family, and my older son at the time, he was about 11 years old at the time, and he said, "Mom, there was someone today at school speaking about data and data science." And I said, "That's fantastic. Was he a dad from school?" And as the words rolled off my mouth, I went, "Ooh." And I hope no one at the table noticed, but no, my family is very well trained. And my husband rolled his eyes, and my son pounced on me and he said, "Mom, that was so biased of you, and it was a woman." Now, if I was very honest with myself, I had a very crystal clear image of who this person was. I could tell you, my assumption of someone working in Google in data science or in that space was definitely Indian. I could tell you which city he came from, what university he went to, what languages he spoke, what food he enjoyed. I had a crystal clear image, cookie cutter image in my mind of who this person was. And so even those of us who are trying to do this work, and are well-intentioned, we also cause harm. We make assumptions. Our biases, consciously or unconsciously, feed through our behavior and the things that we say and do. And I think it is the awareness piece that is super important. But I also think that sometimes some of the errors that we make are around the defensiveness. And that's something I write in The Art of Active Allyship, that when someone points our biases out, I think we then rely on that intention. No, I didn't intend that. I attend the Pride Parade every year. I have friends who are people of color, or my partner is so-and-so. That's what we end up doing as a defense mechanism, rather than sitting with the fact that actually, hang on, pausing for a moment to say, while all of that might be true, I still hold biases, and my mind is wired in a certain way. And in what I've said or done, I have consciously or unconsciously caused harm, and to take responsibility and accountability for that, not in a way to be shamed or to cancel, and I think there's a lot of extremes on that as well, but to use this as a learning opportunity for what can I do differently next time? How do I train perhaps the kind of algorithms and heuristics that my mind is using in different ways? What data and evidence could I challenge myself with so that I'm building a different perspective of the world around me?
And are there any practical examples on how you can do that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, one of the things that it's a very practical way to ascertain kind of who's in my realm, right? The question. So there's many questions you can do. You can talk about who do you trust, but very often when it comes to people we trust, it's often people who are like us. Another great question from a workplace context, which is where I tend to focus my work on, really thinking about who are the 5 people that I go to for workplace advice. And stop thinking about how similar are they to me. And for most of us, I'm not saying everybody, but for the most of us, they're actually quite similar to us. They might be from a similar age group, maybe a similar educational background, maybe similar culturally as well, maybe in terms of even skin color, religion, socioeconomic
Yes.
status, all of these things, we might end up finding that the five people that we go to are very similar. And so, do we
Mm-hmm.
surround ourselves then in an echo chamber of a certain way of approaching decisions, problem solving, innovation, creativity, idea generation? And so, to expand that, right? Not to
Mm-hmm.
don't get rid of those five. They're important to
Yeah.
you. Keep the five people. Clearly, they've
Mm-hmm.
added value to your life. They're still there. But how do you expand that to think about people who are very different from you? Maybe even people who hold perspectives that you may not necessarily agree with. Can they be
Yeah.
part of that circle that, especially for workplace decision making, can I go to someone who thinks very differently about this to challenge how I look at things around me? I think that's super important because the minute we start doing that, we start seeing things from a different perspective and we catch ourselves in what biases we might hold, and they hopefully then will also then be able to point those out. And that leads me on to the next very practical thing is to have a bias compass circle, or bias buddies if you prefer. People that you
Yes.
go to consciously check your biases with. I have a group of
Mm-hmm.
them, and when I write content, when I'm thinking about something or a decision that I need to make, this is the group that I go to say, what am I missing? And of course,
Yeah.
the group needs to have different perspectives, sometimes
Mm-hmm.
perspectives that I'm not seeing, and I may not always like what they're telling me, but it does challenge me to look at
Yeah.
things from a different perspective, to question why I'm looking at it so strongly from the ways I'm looking at. So, two things: ask
Mm-hmm.
yourself who are the five people that you go to for workplace advice. Second is have your bias buddies, people that you can be vulnerable with, who can challenge your own biases, who will ask you questions, but they'll also do it from a place of empathy, that they're
Yeah.
helping you and supporting you, not from a place of aggression to try to put you down. I think that's important there as well.
Absolutely. And I think the first time that I heard you speak, this is what you were talking about, having this sort of community of bias checkers. And you were speaking about the book Leading Through Bias. And before we deep dive into that, could you just take us through your frame of mind when you were writing that book and leading up to that book?
Mm.
Because I see that they're very connected. It's like each book. Yeah.
Absolutely. So I'm going to go back a little bit. Diversifying
Yeah.
diversity, put on the table all of this intersectional aspects of diversity. I would say that we could add more, but the book looks at 12 to start with. And
Yeah.
that led me on as I was writing the book to think about what can I do, very practical things at the individual team level that I can think about. That's where allyship came into the picture and the art of active allyship. Now, as I was doing my leadership workshops and working with organizations, it then became clear that while the art of active allyship focuses on the cultural side of things, there was
Yeah.
also a need to focus on the systemic side. And that is what Leading Through Bias really is. It's a co-authored book with a colleague from CBS, Copenhagen Business School, and both of us were working with a number of organizations on that systemic change, across the employee life cycle at every stage, because a lot of the biases are actually embedded across the employee life cycle. And in
Yeah.
organization, that makes a huge difference to who we attract and who we grow and retain in our organizations. And there's a
Yes.
lot of bias at every step of the way, from thinking about what language we're using in our job description, to thinking about where we're putting our job adverts out, to thinking about how we're shortlisting and the biases that might be there based on someone's name or their age or their photograph, to thinking about, once people are shortlisted for the interview, what that process is like, right? Who are the panelists? What different perspectives do they bring in? Thinking about once someone is hired, what does the onboarding process look like? Do we provide more onboarding to some people and not others? How do we ensure we're setting people up for success to avoid some of those biases that we might be holding? And then so
Yeah.
much that we do once the employee's in the organization, thinking about pay gaps, thinking about what kind of feedback do we provide to who. And there's plenty of research here that shows us that we provide certain types of feedback that are more, for example, based on personality
Yeah.
improvements to women, and we provide different type of feedback that's more career progressing for men. So So what is that having an impact on who gets opportunities and who's able to grow in their career? And that, of course, leads on to retention, right? How do we
Yeah.
retain people in the organization? And even when people leave the organization, what data could we collect there? And how do
Yes.
we, maintain relationships, but also what kind of data can we collect around where biases might exist in the organization? So leading through bias was really written with the intention of there are aspects of cultural change within it. Absolutely, we talk about allyship there as well, but it is really a book that's focused on a deep dive understanding around bias, because I don't believe that many of us really understand necessarily the breadth that biases actually, the forms in which it exists. Of course, we
Yeah.
know of the common ones that are related to our identity, like racism, homophobia, sexism. Those are the ones we often know about, but there's so many
Exactly.
others that have to do with our age. Ageism has to do with beauty bias, university bias, personality bias, neurodiversity bias, socioeconomic classism, casteism, religious
Yeah.
bias, so many, accentism, accent-based bias, so many on the identity side, but then also on how we process information. Regardless of our identity, we live in echo chambers. We have confirmation bias. We have anchoring bias. We have groupthink. We have similarity bias. And there's so many on that side. So really taking that deep dive to say, how does this show up in an institutionalized way, in a systemic
Yeah.
way in our organizations? And then what can we do about it across the employee life cycle? But also some of my work has been with design teams and organizations, thinking about the design
Okay.
process and inclusive design. What questions are we asking? What kind of personas are we looking at when we design products? And of course, organizations need to think about a particular persona based on the market that they're trying to reach, but how can we expand that? And what is the social responsibility for organizations to maybe cater products for part of the market that may not necessarily be a big revenue generator, but it's the right
Yes.
thing to do to cater for that? How do we
Yeah.
navigate that? But also thinking about inclusive marketing, right? And we know we can talk about many examples where marketing has terribly gone wrong, right?
Yes.
And even in recent times, right? And so how do we ensure that marketing campaigns are hitting the right notes, that they're not causing harmful impact? Because the reality is that we consume so much of this kind of content, and it has that influence on how we look at people around us. So marketing campaigns have, in many ways, I think, a responsibility in the narratives and the stereotypes and the prejudices that they are maybe perpetuating through their ad campaign. So a lot of it is around the
Definitely.
systemic change, and that's what leading through bias is really about.
That's so good. Have there been instances when you bring out these biases, and what have been the reactions in those rooms?
Um, And that actually gets me to my latest book, which looks at fear, right? And
Yeah.
that resistance that people have towards these topics, and the discomfort that really comes to be when we are confronted with our biases. I think for
Yeah.
the most part, because I frame it from a neuroscience perspective to say that we receive such a vast amount of information, but we only
Exactly.
process a tiny, tiny, tiny amount of it. I think that brings people to the table a little bit more easily. I also adopt the kind of approach that we are all biased. And so this is not
Yes.
about shaming people, but recognizing where our biases are so that we can do better. I think that's
Yeah.
the kind of tone and narrative that I come in with, which means that people are a little bit more willing to engage on it. I also
Yeah.
use myself as an example of where my own biases are, and that I think creates an environment of hopefully a safe space for them to also introspect around where
Yeah.
their own biases might be. And the last thing is, my approach has always been grounded in research and evidence, and so it's very hard to kind of dispute well researched, well cited, credible data and evidence around this. So I think that
Yeah.
combination of that approach, for the most part, I think people are willing to engage, they're willing to reflect, they're willing to acknowledge that they are biased. It's not easy. It creates discomfort. I use
Absolutely.
interventions in my sessions where people do get uncomfortable. And as I
Yeah.
often tell my clients, if you are not getting uncomfortable today, then you don't need to pay my invoice, because I do believe that in discomfort, that's where change is born.
Yeah.
But we also need to create a space where it's discomfort, and then what do we do about it? I think a lot of bias awareness sessions stop at the discomfort, and
Yeah.
it has a tone of superiority on the part of the trainer and a shaming towards the participants. And I think that doesn't get us to where we'd like to be. I think there
Yeah.
needs to be a different approach to this, and that's what I try and do in my sessions, while also creating adequate discomfort, but also leaving people with the tools for what can they do then to challenge their own biases and challenge the cultural biases and systemic biases around them.
Yeah. I have so many things that I would like us to get deeper into. For instance, on the talent management side, I would like us to get into a bit deeper into some of those biases throughout the life cycle. But I also like that you brought up some of these workshops that you hold, because I saw one of your recent posts on LinkedIn where you had the students have this sort of, the way I understood it, like some sort of cultural simulation, and how does that play out,
Yeah.
if you may?
Absolutely. So in one of the courses that programs that I run, we use a cultural simulation tool, and it's an exercise where the class is divided into two cultures. They have to learn their own culture. Each of the cultures learns their own culture for a short period of time. Then they start engaging and interacting with the other culture in small groups and come back and report. And it's a really great way for students, and I would argue I've run this with adults, executives as well, and it's a really great way to explore the topics around how quickly we develop in group, that the culture and the norms of behavior, even within 10, 15 minutes, one culture has got such an understanding about these norms and how you should behave. And anyone who visits who doesn't understand that, they're treated as outsiders, the out group. And so it brings to light some of this in-group, out-group dynamics, which students then and participants then get to reflect upon, but also thinking about how quickly we develop stereotypes from generalizations, that when our initial interactions might be about they are like this or they are like that, as we describe another culture, so more generalizations. But very quickly, as we understand that when we are treated as an outsider, there's a consequence to that, and it might be a negative consequence, our generalizations very, very quickly become stereotypes, negative stereotypes about the other culture. So it's a really great way. And regardless of who we are in that room, we have this shared experience of what it likes to be part of the in-group and what it likes to be part of the out-group. And I think that's a very common experience that we have in the classroom, to then have those deeper conversations. So I find it to be an incredibly powerful tool. This is part of a program we run here at Imperial called Values Day, which all our master's students and undergraduate students go through in order for them to really take a deep dive into the role that our values have on culture, on the cultural biases that exist, and how that influences our interactions as we work with people who are different from us.
Absolutely. And I like that it comes at student level, because that's the next generation of organizational leaders. And that way, hopefully, some of these biases can be minimized.
Absolutely.
You did mention that you do approach these conversations with research and a lot of examples. However, there's still backlash in the world, especially today. How have you dealt with that?
Yeah.
And how has it affected you?
Yep. So I think it's affected me in very deep ways, but it's also been the pillar of my fourth book, which is really around thinking about why does this backlash exist, is really the question that I was grappling with before 2025. So I've worked on this for more than 2 years, really trying to understand it. And the early signs of this actually go back to, again, linking that thread through my books. It started off with The Art of Active Allyship, built on in Leading Through Bias. So in both those books, I talk about this resistance as well. And then I decided that that was the area that I was going to deep dive into, to really try to understand, where does it come from? And so my research shows that this backlash comes from the core issue of fear, or emotion of fear. And fear shows up in many different ways. It can show up as feeling overwhelmed, feeling anxious, feeling worried, feeling scared, frightened. And all of these emotions, when we look at prior research around emotions, comes down to the core human emotion of fear. And we are fearful of fear itself. And that is the irony of all of this. But it's also what we need to acknowledge. It's the elephant in the room, if you'd like, that if we don't talk about what we're fearful of, how do we let go of it? And perhaps, as I argue in my book, that is why we're not making the kind of progress we're making, because we are in a toxic positive environment where we want to talk about everything positive in our workplaces. We're all good. We have a happy culture. Everyone is good and jolly, and we have these set of values, and we're all, working together towards that. And while, yes, we'd like that, but it doesn't take away from the complexity of human experience, which includes negative emotions like fear. And diversity, equity, and inclusion, because it often challenges the ways in which we have enjoyed maybe our privilege and advantage and space that we have occupied before. It creates discomfort, as we've talked about today as well, with confronting our biases. In today's world with a cancel culture, it also means that many of us are worried about what we can say or do. Some of us who are working in this field also know that there's a personal cost to doing this work. Being labeled the DI police or the Vogue police or whatever you want to call that, but also on a personal level that it can lead to abuse, verbal, physical abuse, that there's a stress and a strain that comes with doing this work, but also thinking about the fact that we're not making lots of progress, right? It almost feels like we're going backwards. So given all these fears, which to me, of course, are very much all 5 of those fears I can recognize in my own self. So it's not just people who are sitting on the other side, and I put that in quotations, who experience these fears. Even those of us in this space and advocating for greater inclusion, belonging, representation, fairness in our workplaces, that even we experience many of these fears. And I think that was an important part of my research. But of course, I've also experienced backlash. I've had, experiences that are less than ideal, that cause trauma, of course, in our lives. And that isn't easy to deal with and still show up to do this work again and again and again. But I also, as I write in my latest book, can I say that we also need to self-care. And I'm not particularly great at that, but it is something I'm working really hard on myself to say that, if I step away for a little while because I need that self-care, it doesn't mean that I care about this any less. It's just that if I want to continue doing this work for the long haul, then there are moments when we need to step away. And that is something that we do need to talk about more.
Yeah, I agree, because from personal experience, it's one of those things where it feels like it's a personal attack when you're doing this kind of work, because you have your lived experience and you have the research backing it. But the moment you speak about it, you get backlash, and then you kind of take it personal. At least there have been moments when I have.
And the problem there is because something that is meant to be perhaps not as politicized or not politicized is now politicized, right?
Yes.
And so we have also given people the license to overtly express their backlash. And in some ways, I think it helps those of us working in this space to really sharpen up how we are communicating on this, the kind of work we're doing, moving away from the performative work to focusing on that systemic and cultural change. And for us to reflect more deeply that perhaps there's some aspects about this work that we have not done right. We have created a zero-sum mentality around this. We have created an opportunity of othering and us versus them. Um, and and particularly the us versus them, we've kind of pitched two people against each other,
Yes.
two groups against each other. And unfortunately, that doesn't help us move things forward. So it's about how do we build that or bridge the divide, if you'd like.
Yeah, I like that. And it's really important because at the end of the day, like you said, when you do have conversations with people that don't hold the same opinions as you, and you get down to like, okay, what about the basics? You find that you actually agree on the goal. It's just the approaches that are quite different.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I write about in Can I Say That is really around the need for greater dialogue and moving away from a debate culture. I think we live in a world where there's there's a lot of debating going on. And by debating, I
Yes.
mean that you take a stand and you defend that stand to the very end. You
Yeah.
find data, evidence, sometimes not credible, sometimes even fake, with AI and hallucinations, but you defend it to the end, whichever side, right?
Yeah.
And with human behavior, it's complex. There's
Yeah.
multiple realities that coexist. It is not easy to say that it is this or this. And what we need is more dialogue. But a lot of the
Yeah.
dialogue we see, again in quotations, is actually dialogue or debate disguised as dialogue, let's put it that way, right? And
Yeah.
it's not actually real dialogue where we're there from a deep sense of curiosity to want to find out why someone who holds such different views from me, how did they get there? What life experiences led them to that point to hold such
Yes.
strong views that are so different from my own? Like, as human
Yeah.
beings, we maybe assume, shouldn't we all have similar experiences? But we don't, right?
We
And that is the
don't.
complexity of human experience. And why do they get to where they are? And if we can understand that, then and come to a place of where both parties are coming there to want to respect the other person's, acknowledge the other person's life experiences, but also being willing to challenge is a strong word because challenge often is associated with, being aggressive.
Negative.
But I don't mean it in an aggressive way. I mean that I want people to say, well, how about if you looked at it this way? What
Yeah.
if you looked at it this way? Can I share some credible evidence here and research that shows this is the case? And if I shared that with you, would you be willing to maybe reconsider some of the patterns that you hold in your mind? I think that's what we need more of, and I don't necessarily think we have enough of those. I'm not saying they don't exist, but I don't think there's enough.
And what about a case where you do have that dialogue and are you willing to reconsider and it's still a no?
Yeah, I mean, look, we can't at the end of the day change everyone's mind through one conversation, but I do believe that once we plant these seeds, whether the person wants to admit it or not to us, um, they have been challenged, right? And
Yeah.
I mean that challenge in the way that I define it, but they have been asked to reconsider their ways of thinking. And, it automatically, it puts on the radar in the mind that there might be a different way of looking at things. And that may make people want to seek this out, try to look for a different viewpoint. Maybe they start recognizing things that they hadn't seen before. I think those are important things. So even if we, at the end of a conversation, don't walk away, and I think we need to be okay with that. I think that's part of setting the guardrails, if you like, of these conversations. Yes, it needs to be grounded in respect, but it also, we need to be agreeable that, it's okay if we don't come to an agreement at the end of this. I may not agree with everything you're saying, but can we have a rich conversation that comes from curiosity and the genuine desire to want to understand the other side?
Oh, I like that. Okay. I'm going to do this for the first time on the podcast, and it's sort of a quick fire round because there's a lot for us that we can get into details. But Being aware of time, let's just see where your mind is at.
Okay.
I will ask you something and you just let me know in a few words or a word. What's one bias you've caught yourself having?
So many. Gender, definitely. Um, various cultural biases. Um, yeah, biases. Growing up in Singapore, um, you know, biases that I held around the LGBTQ plus community as well. So, and those are all biases that I've had to challenge in myself.
Great. One thing that I like about you from the first time I learned about you is you always have a book recommendation or a thinker. Could you name a book or a thinker who's deeply shaped your approach?
Um, I think the work of Kimberly Crenshaw, it's not a book, but a thinker, has really shaped the intersectional lens. So with everything I do, I think um, Professor Kimberly Crenshaw's work has had a deep influence on how I look at things and constantly challenging myself. But there are also books that I would love to recommend. There's a book
Yes.
called that's just come out yesterday, actually called Don't Be Yourself.
Okay.
And it's a book by Thomas Chamorro, and he writes about, it's critique to authenticity. So even in my earlier books, I've written about bring your whole self to work, with the understanding that it needs to be that more nuanced understanding, not just showing up to say anything I want, whenever I want, however I want, but understanding
Yes.
that what we say, do has an impact on other people. And that's what he is. I'm just listening to it right now, and I could not recommend this more. I think it's a beautiful take on that authenticity comes with responsibility as well, and accountability.
Yes.
And that is the kind of authenticity we want, not this kind of authenticity that, I can say whatever I want, even if it causes harm. I can behave any way I want in an organization. That is not the kind of authenticity we want. So that's a book. And one of my dear, closest kind of people that I look up to in this space is Ruchika Tulshan, and she's written a book called, I think it's called Uncompete, which I'm waiting. It's coming out. Yeah. And so I'm looking forward to those two books. Yeah.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah.
One hope you have for inclusion in tech and leadership.
I'm going to start off with a story. I know you said one
Yes.
word, but I can't. I don't do one word answers. I never do one word answers. So, I think. Look, I did an engineering degree as my bachelor's degree. When you're from South Asia, there are really three career pathways that I thought of as being prestigious. You can be a lawyer, a doctor, or an engineer. I didn't want to be a lawyer or a doctor, so engineering it was. I always wanted to study human behavior, but the questions around me were, what kind of career would you have, right? And so I was stereotypically model minority, good at math and science. So off I did to do an engineering degree.
Yeah.
But at the time when I did it, none of my instructors looked like me. In a class of tutorials, I was often the only woman. There were a handful of women. None of the leaders in the organizations where I could consider working in looked like me.
Wow.
And so my hope, I suppose, is that looks different today, and it does to some extent. But I also think we have issues that we need to solve for, because we do see a lot more women taking up STEM degrees, and in certain contexts, it's actually more women than men. But we see drop-offs, two main drop-offs. We see a drop-off after they finish their degree to actually taking up a career in the STEM industries. And then we see a drop-off around middle management before, before we move up in the corporate hierarchy. And those are things we need to address. Why is this the case? And of course, there's research that shows us what the issues are, around the lack of role models, the biases that exist in society. And it's not just men holding these biases. I think that's really, really important to understand, that even women hold these biases around what kind of roles we can play within the STEM sector. So I think it's really important for us to address that. So my hope is that we change those dynamics.
Yeah. And how can teams then be more inclusive not the organization, just the smaller teams?
I think it's really simple day-to-day nudges and practices. So it is a lot of the biases that we experience happen just before the team meeting, maybe just after, as we're getting coffee, perhaps, and it's being really mindful about compliments, really being mindful about humor that we use, well-intentioned remarks, those are all the things we want to keep in mind. But also in team settings, it's about whose voice is being heard, who are the dominant voices, and whose perspectives are we actually missing? And how do we put interventions in place to be able to challenge that, right? To make sure that the voices that are not being heard are actually heard. And one of my favorite things, it's really simple thing to do, but when you ask a question in a team, especially when it's one of those team meetings where it's about brainstorming for ideas, take a pause. Put together a moment of silence where people actually pause. And it doesn't need to be 20 minutes. It can be even 1 minute with post-its, for example. But create that pause and then make sure that you go around the room, not starting with the most senior person, but really going around the room and having people share their input. I think there's a lot there that allows for us to be able to hear the voices that are often not heard. And finally, when it comes to team decision making, it's to really create that psychologically safe environment that we as a team want to make the best quality decisions possible. If that is the case, and that's a common norm and understanding around agreement and understanding around what we want to achieve, then when we notice bias in our decision making, then we need to be able to point it out. And it doesn't need to be aggressive. It's not about pointing fingers, anything like that, but it is about saying, what are we missing out here? I feel like this bias is at play. Could we challenge that? Or whose perspective have we not considered as we make this decision? Just having that sense check around these things.
Yeah.
And like I said, they're not difficult things, but they need to become practice because decisions are made so quickly, right? We want to move on. We've got timelines and deadlines. But if these become part of our, daily practice, weekly practice through our meetings, I think there's an opportunity there.
Absolutely. For people that have not read or heard about your books, how should they go about reading them? Because they're very interconnected.
I mean, each of the books is standalone. You don't need prior to have read the earlier book to be able to read the next one at all. They're interconnected. And at the same time, if you want to follow it through and follow the thread through as I've described it today, then start with Diversifying Diversity, move to the art of active allyship, leading through bias, and then Can I Say That? And you'll see that thread and the themes that led to the next book. But really, you can start anywhere. I also do create a lot of content on LinkedIn as well. So you're more than welcome to follow me there if you want kind of the daily nudges from Monday to Friday.
Yes. Do you have a favorite of your books?
Oh, that's another question I haven't been asked before. I think maybe Can I Say That is so far my favorite. It's the latest one, of course. And as you get better and better with writing, I suppose you start maybe... But I also think more than anything, it's so topical and so necessary. I feel like, it's... but it's also the book that has challenged and been challenged the most. So I feel like it's not the most... The other books are a bit more comfortable maybe for people to read. But this requires people to confront their fears. And so I feel like it's a bit more provocative. And I kind of like that.
That's good. I can't wait to read it because I started it, but I haven't finished it to the end. I've just read the first few parts.
Fantastic.
So in conclusion, what's next for you and where can people find you?
So you can find me on LinkedIn, like I said. What's next for me? I'm actually adjusting to a new job at Imperial Business School, so I'm really focused on that for the next few months. But I do have the next research project brewing in my head. So hopefully 2026 will be a productive year on that side of things. So I'm excited to get into that. But for now, I'm focusing on the here and now and adjusting to a new environment. But definitely, if you follow me on LinkedIn, I'm sure Q1 2026 will be the time when I start launching my research into the new area, and then hopefully 27 or 28 will be the next book.
Oh, great. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Poornima.
Welcome.
This has been the Tech Girl Podcast. Listening to Dr. Poornima, I'm reminded that inclusion is not a checkbox. It's permission to keep learning. I hope you felt that too. Bias isn't about what others hold. It's what we're brave enough to unlearn, as I earlier mentioned, within ourselves. If this episode made you pause, share it with someone who's building something or a muscle of awareness and empathy, because they need to hear this message. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing you, hearing you, sharing with you, communicating on social media, as well as in the next episode of the Tech Girl Podcast, where we will talk more about inclusion and what it means to be part of building the next level of technology. My name is Gertrude. Take care. Bye.